"Embarrassing, but I still have to introduce her," my stepfather announced, his smug laugh echoing across the crowded dining room. The guests chuckled on cue, eyeing my simple attire while showering praise on my stepsister and her high-profile engagement. My stepfather had spent nearly 2 decades diminishing my life, assuming I had achieved nothing worth mentioning. He smugly gestured toward his daughter's fiancé, a decorated former 75th Ranger Regiment veteran. "Try not to bore him with your little routine," he sneered. But the moment the ranger looked up, the arrogance in the room evaporated. His eyes locked onto mine, his casual smile vanishing into sheer disbelief. He didn't laugh. He didn't look down on me. Instead, he snapped to attention, squared his shoulders, and threw a crisp textbook salute right in front of everyone. "Ma'am, it is an absolute honor to meet you." The entire room froze. "My name is Linda Mercer. I am 36 years old, and for the past 19 years I have been treated as an unwelcome ghost in my own family." That dynamic started the day my mother married Richard Caldwell. Richard was a man obsessed with appearances, social pedigree, and material wealth. From the moment he entered our lives, he made it abundantly clear that his biological daughter, Vanessa, was destined for greatness, while I was simply an awkward obligation to tolerate. Throughout my entire adult life, Richard never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how unaccomplished I supposedly was. When Vanessa graduated with a marketing degree, he threw a lavish country club gala. When I quietly pursued my own path and spent years away from home, he dismissed my absence as aimless wandering, telling relatives I was merely floating through life without ambition or direction. So, when an engraved invitation arrived for Vanessa's extravagant engagement dinner at an upscale steakhouse downtown, I knew exactly what to expect. Vanessa was engaged to Tyler, a decorated former Army Ranger whom Richard had spent weeks bragging about to every business associate he knew. Richard had only invited me out of sheer social obligation, ensuring I had a front-row seat to Vanessa's triumph. I arrived wearing a simple navy blazer and slacks, hoping to offer polite congratulations and leave without incident. But the moment I stepped into the private dining room, Richard caught my eye, smirked, and prepared to turn me into the evening's easy punchline. The private dining room gleamed with polished crystal, heavy silverware, and the unmistakable hum of manufactured prestige. Richard held court at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet while regaling extended relatives and business associates with tales of his latest corporate acquisitions. Vanessa sat beside him, basking in the glow of his constant flattery, showing off her diamond ring to anyone who leaned in close enough to pretend they cared. I took an empty seat near the far end, hoping to blend into the background, but Richard's radar for easy targets was finely tuned. The moment the waitstaff poured the first round of wine, he stood up, tapping his glass with a fork to command the room's undivided attention. "Now that we're all settled," Richard announced, his voice carrying that booming, self-congratulatory cadence, "I'd like to properly introduce the man who is joining our family. Tyler is a true patriot, a former Army Ranger who served this country with elite distinction before transitioning into corporate security leadership." A polite round of applause filled the room as Tyler gave a reserved, courteous nod. But Richard wasn't finished. His eyes scanned the table, locking directly onto me with a patronizing smirk. He gestured in my direction, deliberately setting up the contrast he had spent 19 years engineering. "And, of course," Richard laughed dismissively, "we have Linda. She's an embarrassment, really, drifting through life with no real career or achievements to speak of. But family is family, so I suppose I still have to introduce her." A few quiet chuckles rippled across the table, people laughing simply to appease Richard's arrogance. Vanessa smirked, leaning back in her chair to savor the public insult. Richard beamed, clearly anticipating that Tyler would chuckle along with the joke and join in cementing my status as the family failure. Instead, the dining room fell dead silent. Tyler turned his head toward me. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in my posture, the clean lines of my shoulders, and the quiet stillness I kept in the face of Richard's petty mockery. For 3 long seconds, Tyler didn't move. Then, the polite smile on his face completely vanished. His jaw set, his gaze hardened with instant recognition, and every muscle in his body seemed to lock into ironclad discipline. Before anyone could say another word, Tyler pushed his heavy dining chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He didn't offer a casual handshake or a sympathetic smile. He stepped out from the table, snapped his heels together with sharp, mechanical precision, squared his shoulders, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a flawless textbook military salute. "Ma'am," Tyler said, his voice cutting through the room with the commanding resonance of a soldier addressing superior authority. "It is an absolute honor to meet you in person." Richard's smug grin froze in place. The wine glass in my mother's hand trembled slightly. The guests exchanged bewildered, uncomfortable glances, entirely unsure whether Tyler had just cracked an elaborate joke or if the entire foundation beneath their feet had suddenly shifted. Richard let out an awkward, sputtering laugh, waving a hand dismissively as if to swat away a ridiculous misunderstanding. "Tyler, son, you must have her confused with someone else," Richard stammered, his face tightening with sudden embarrassment. "Linda is just a quiet civilian. She has spent her adult years floating around without a real career, while you were out serving on the front lines." Tyler did not lower his posture, nor did his expression soften. He turned a cold, piercing stare directly onto my stepfather. "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell, I know exactly who I am looking at. This is Lieutenant Colonel Linda Mercer." A collective gasp swept through the dining room. Vanessa's fork dropped onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. "In our community, everyone knows Colonel Mercer's name," Tyler continued, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding conviction. "During my second deployment overseas, her strategic coordination and battlefield oversight pulled an entire forward unit out of hostile territory when everything went sideways. She is a decorated combat veteran, a senior tactical commander, and one of the most respected minds in joint operations." Tyler turned back toward me, his eyes filled with profound reverence. "We wore the Ranger tab with pride, ma'am. But officers like you were the reason my brothers and I made it back to American soil alive. It is a genuine privilege to stand in the same room with you." Richard's face drained of every ounce of color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray. The heavy silence settled deep as 19 years of calculated lies, petty condescension, and cheap arrogance collapsed under the truth. I slowly set my water glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. The clink of crystal against wood seemed to echo like thunder in the stunned quiet. For 19 years, Richard had constructed a small, pathetic world where he got to be the grand authority, deciding who was worthy of respect and who was merely collateral damage to his ego. "You spent nearly 2 decades telling everyone I amounted to nothing, Richard," I said, my voice steady, measured, and devoid of the anger he probably expected. "Whenever my service kept me away, you claimed I was drifting aimlessly. When I couldn't attend family dinners because I was coordinating personnel in combat zones, you told the relatives I had no ambition." I looked over at my mother, whose eyes welled with sudden, stinging tears of regret. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze after years of passively enabling his cruelty. Richard cleared his throat nervously, his hands fidgeting with his napkin as he scrambled to regain control. "Now, Linda, Colonel, you know I was only joking. Family banter. We've always been immensely proud of your service. I just didn't realize the extent of your duties, that's all." Tyler let out a sharp, incredulous breath, cutting through Richard's desperate spin. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell, someone who protects this country and commands thousands doesn't require validation from a country club dining table, nor does a senior officer's sacrifice get reduced to cheap table banter." Richard opened his mouth to reply, but the words withered in his throat. The mask had shattered, and there was no piecing it back together. The remaining course of dinner dissolved into an unbearable, stifling silence. The grand pedestal Richard had spent decades building underneath himself had completely collapsed in less than 5 minutes. He sat slumped in his leather chair, barely touching his meal, staring blankly at the polished cutlery, while the relatives he had spent the evening trying to impress shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vanessa tried to pivot, offering a nervous, high-pitched laugh, and leaning across the table to ask about my life, suddenly desperate to associate herself with a high-ranking military officer. Two uncles who had previously laughed at Richard's jokes now chimed in, asking eager questions about my tactical career and heaping lavish praise on my dedication. I gave them polite, concise nods, refusing to indulge their sudden, opportunistic respect. True honor isn't something granted by fair-weather relatives looking to ride someone else's coattails. When the dessert plates arrived untouched, I pushed my chair back and stood up. Tyler immediately stood as well, maintaining a posture of sharp, respectful discipline. I extended my hand, and we exchanged a firm, mutual handshake that carried more unspoken understanding than anyone else in that room could ever comprehend. "Thank you for your service, Tyler," I said quietly. "Keep taking care of your people." "Always, Colonel," he replied with genuine warmth. I looked down at Richard one last time. He couldn't even look me in the eye. Without another word, I picked up my blazer and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the small, hollow man to drown in the silence of his own making. Walking out into the cool evening air, I took a deep, liberating breath. For 19 years, I had allowed Richard's petty insults to linger in the back of my mind, wondering if I had somehow failed by choosing a quiet path of service over superficial social status. But standing in that dining room, watching a true warrior cut through 2 decades of arrogance with a single salute, I realized something essential. Real strength never needs to shout. True accomplishment doesn't require an audience, expensive suits, or the need to tear down others just to feel important. People who are genuinely accomplished carry their honor quietly, while those who are hollow inside will always use cruelty as a shield to mask their own insignificance. Richard hadn't diminished me. He had simply exposed himself to everyone who mattered. I drove home that night with complete peace, knowing that my dignity, my career, and my self-worth were never Richard's to measure in the first place. Some people spend their entire lives chasing an illusion of power, only to be humbled the moment they encounter genuine character. Now I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever faced a family member or coworker who constantly tried to belittle your achievements, only to have the truth speak for itself? What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to mention the city or country you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Thank you for watching, and be sure to check out the 2 videos on your screen right now for more powerful stories.